I just briefly, before I introduce our speakers, give you a notice of our second event, second meeting here. It will be on February 7th, where we are going to have a film exhibit of a film about the Amazon region, normally portrayed for its exotic aspects, a place in peril. Well, there is this American lawyer who, for the last 30 years, went to many times to Brazil, wrote 2 books, and now produced a video portraying the Amazon from the perspective of the 20+ million people that live in the Amazon, mostly in cities. And it's quite an interesting film, February 7th at 3:30 in the afternoon. We have the honor, just joined us, the president of the Wilson Center, Jane Harmon, who is here, has actually supported everything we did last year at the Brazil Institute, and we are very glad to have her here, at least for a while, with her Chief of Staff, John Haas, also a good friend of the Brazil Institute. Today, we will focus, as I mentioned, on the first year of President Dilma's administration, with 4 speakers that are real experts on Brazil. I'd like to start the introduction with David Fleischer, Professor Emeritus from the University of Brasilia, who actually has helped educate and train a bunch of Brazilians that are now raised to very important positions in Brazil. Actually, one of the first alum from the first group of political science students from the University of Brasilia, Adriana Machado, has just been named CEO of GE in Brazil, which is quite interesting news. Is the first person that, not being an engineer, not being in the operations, has been named to that position in Brazil. And Adriana, like many others, have benefited greatly from David's work as a professor at the University of Brasilia. In the order they will be speaking, Christopher Garman, Director of Latin America Practice, head at the Eurasia Group, whose analysis on Brazil and more generally on the region are very sharp, and he's returning to the Wilson Center to be with us and to help us understand the situation that we described in the title of this, with a question: why Brazilians like Dilma despite the bad news? Also joining us, Kelly Mayman, former officer of the U.S. government, State Department, has for some years now worked in the private sector, McClarty Associates, and goes to Brazil very frequently, and goes to other places actually very frequently. Sometimes she's in Asia, sometimes she's in Brazil, sometimes she's in Europe, and sometimes she's even in Washington. So we are very glad that we caught her here. And Diego Bonomo, a dear friend, Senior Policy Director at the Brazil-U.S. Business Council, who is a good analyst of Brazil-U.S. relations from the perspective of the business community, and who has made the world happier the last days of last year by announcing the birth of Lara, his second child, with his wife Cristiane, who is a Brazilian diplomat and a dear friend. So with that, I just wanted to give you a little bit of a synopsis of an article that I published on BBC News about the first year of Dilma, and that inspired me to get to this title to the event. Dilma Rousseff faced two sets of very bad news in her first year as president. First, an economy that had expanded 7.5% in 2010, really decelerated to something like 3% last year, or even less than 3%. We'll see the final numbers soon. This was obviously not welcome news, but expected. As you probably know, the Brazilian economy cannot grow sustainably much above 4% without generating inflation, because there are reforms, there are bottlenecks that need to be removed and resolved for that to happen. But it was one set of very bad news for Dilma Rousseff. The other thing was corruption. There was an explosion of corruption scandals in her cabinet. It's very interesting the way she dealt with that, and I think the positive reaction Brazilians have vis-a-vis Dilma had to do with that. 6 of her ministers were fired or let go, and she was not tainted by those episodes, because I think she was able to convey the idea that she was separating herself from corruption scandals. To have politicians accused of illegal acts is no news in Brazil, but it is indeed news in Brazil to have them lose their jobs. And that's what I think the population reacted to. Also, it's something that I point out in the article. It's my own personal view. The fact that she has shown some leadership qualities that were not part of what was expected of this lady that was basically a technocrat. She reached out to political opponents, particularly to former President Fernando Henrique Cardoso and to the governor of São Paulo, the most important state in Brazil, and in a way that lowered the political temperature in Brazil and created new spaces for cooperation, for collaboration. And this was, to mention actress Fernanda Montenegro, was an act of political civility that we have not seen in Brazil for a while. And I think people interpreted this very well. And Dilma is today, as David will explain to us in detail, supported or has an approval rating that is quite high. With that, I would like to invite David Fleischer. I don't know if you want to speak from here, from where you are, from here. Sir, come on. Thank you. Me dá pedaço do seu bloquinho.
Well, good afternoon to you all, and also Happy New Year. It's a pleasure to be back here in Washington and participate in another event about Brazil here in the Woodrow Wilson Center in the Brazil Institute. As Paulo has given us the title of Why Brazilians Like Dilma Despite the Bad News, I'm going to talk about her first year in office and challenges and some positive results. As Paulo mentioned, Dilma has had quite a good standing in the political opinion polls in Brazil, and her approval rating has improved during the year of 2011. After 3 months in office, actually, her approval rating was better than either that of Lula or of Fernando Henrique Cardoso or the other 2 presidents I've listed here, Itamar Franco and Fernando Collor. The first survey done in March of 2011, she was given a 47% approval rating, and Lula posted in at 43. This gives you the breakdown of the Datafolha polls in March, June, and August for Dilma in 2011 and Lula in 2003. So you can see that their trace is similar. Lula in the low 40s, mid 40s, and Dilma in the high 40s percentage of good or excellent approval ratings. The other poll is done by Ibope for the National Confederation of Industries, and they did 4 polls during 2011. They also did 4 polls for Lula in exactly the same, more or less the same months in 2003. So you can see that Dilma started off at 73%, but then dropped down in her approval rating to of the evaluation of her as president to 67%, then back up to 71, and then finally last month to 72. The increase in September and then finally in December, or the jump from 67 to 71 between July and September, according to the pollsters, this had a lot to do with how she handled the corruption crisis in those months of July, August, and September. And the evaluation of her government also suffered a slight decline in July and then back up again in September and December. Because Dilma was elected on the coattails of Lula's tremendous popularity in October 2010, last year Lula's popularity or approval rating topped 80%, which is unheard of in political opinion polling in Brazil. Many thought that her government would be just a third term for Lula, and she would just continue and be a third term for Lula. And my answer to that is only in part. Well, 16 of her cabinet ministers were holdovers from Lula's government, which was part of the problem with the corruption scandals in June, July, August, and September, where the 6 ministers that Paulo mentioned who were let go or persuaded to quit or to resign were all holdovers from the Lula period. But Dilma came into her own really up front in 2011, very, very strong on human rights positions, for example. In the domestic arena, finally the Truth Commission was approved by Congress, something Lula had initiated, but Dilma was able to finalize. And this Truth Commission will begin operating in May of this year. Different from the Truth Commissions in Argentina, then Chile, and more recently in Uruguay, where the investigations have the power to indict and to condemn people, convict people for prison terms. This will just be a fact-finding, information-gathering Truth Commission. At the international level, she began a new policy position different from that Lula had, called responsibility while protecting. And this policy was applied both to Brazil's position on Libya and also currently to the position on Syria. I thought this I have always thought since January 1st last year, this picture is extremely significant. The women who are seated here were some of Dilma's torture colleagues during her torture period in the early 70s in a public security prison in Sao Paulo. And she invited 12 of these women to her inaugural reception, her inaugural ceremony at Itamaraty on the 1st of January last year. So for me, this was a very important gesture as to what would be her new policy regarding human rights. That's the only picture I have in my PowerPoint presentation. However, Dilma did not ignore corruption accusations, as Paulo mentioned. Both Lula and Cardoso sort of looked the other way and really didn't pay much attention to the accusations regarding corruption in their cabinets. So Dilma went through what the Brazilians called cabinet house cleaning, or faxina. 6 ministers were replaced, 3 from the PMDB and 1 each from the PR, PCdoB, and PT. None from the PT so far. These parties ended up not leaving the coalition because other people from their party were appointed to be the new minister. All 6 were holdovers from Lula's government. Lula very strongly pressured Dilma to accept the continuation of these cabinet ministers in her new cabinet. Dilma has a very strong majority in Congress, stronger than Lula had in his second government, especially in the Senate. Lula campaigned in 2010 very actively in several states to defeat PSDB and Dem senators seeking re-election in the 2010 elections. So the opposition was considerably weakened or reduced in its size, and especially with the creation of the new PSD party in October 2011. The opposition was reduced to such a small size that constitutionally they are not able to convoke investigating commissions, CPIs, on their own. There were some strains that were produced with the PMDB, Dilma's coalition partner, regarding austerity budget cuts, and especially the timely or untimely release of budget items, pet budget projects by deputies and senators, and for federal appointments. In 2011, Dilma and her government approved almost everything they were trying to approve in the Congress. The minimum wage, the new minimum wage calculation, what we call the DRU, which is a special earmarking of budget funds, up to 20% that can be manipulated, reorganized, reallocated by the president. Also, the approval of the Truth Commission and the approval of the new Super CAGI, which is Brazil's antitrust and pro-competition agency. However, she suffered some, in quotes, defeats. The Forest Code was approved in the Chamber of Deputies, not exactly in line with what Dilma wanted with the revision of this Forest Code, and is undergoing modifications now in 2012. A question of petroleum royalties, which also is undergoing some modifications in 2012. The question of petroleum royalties is a new series of laws dealing with how you distribute petroleum royalties from the exploration of petroleum offshore, also onshore in Brazil. Previously, these royalties had been distributed to, let's say, participating states and municipalities on the coastline of Brazil, mostly Sao Paulo, Rio, Espírito Santo, and Bahia, and the municipalities along the coastlines. Now, the proposal that was passed in the Chamber of Deputies said, okay, these petroleum royalties are going to be distributed not only among producing states and municipalities, but also non-producers as well, the whole country. And so, as you might imagine, states like Rio de Janeiro were quite upset that this item in their budget, petroleum royalties, would be reduced considerably. Now, that's still undergoing some modifications. And a new health tax was outright rejected by Congress as well. This table gives you a little idea of the distribution of the parties in the Chamber of Deputies and in the Senate. The 2010 column in both the Senate and the Chamber is what this looked like after the elections in 2010. And as you can see, in 2011, which is now the end of last year, the government block in the Chamber of Deputies increased from 358 to 402, and in the Senate from 49 to 64. And the opposition was considerably reduced, as I showed you, as I said before, from 137 to 102 in the Chamber, and from 30 down to 16 in the Senate. This was in large part, but not totally, due to the creation of the new PSD party, which, as you can see, the PSD went from 0 to 47 deputies and took a lot from the Dem and some from the PSDB.
David,
yes,
just one thing that some people may not know, the number of congressmen in Brazil, the number of senators. If you could
yes, the total deputies are 513, and the total senators are 81. I didn't put the final line for totals in because this, as you can see, this chart occupies almost the whole screen. So yes, 513 deputies and 81 senators. The totals for the Chamber of Deputies are only 512 because I have excluded the PT president of the Chamber of Deputies. The economy, which Paula mentioned as one of the problems that Dilma has faced. As Paula mentioned, the GDP declined from a large 7.5% increase in 2010, mostly because of election year spending, which the Treasury was opened wide for spending in 2010, down to below 3%. Most people think maybe 2.9% in 2011. We don't know yet the figures for the fourth quarter, which will only be available probably in early March. EPCA inflation, which is the official inflation index in 2011, was right exactly at the upper limit of the central bank's target, 6.5%. However, the consumer price index for lower classes that was done by the Getúlio Vargas Foundation was just barely less than 6%. We've had over, especially the second semester of 2011, a reduction in the number of new jobs created, net new jobs created, month by month. Consumer buying has been down slightly in the second semester, which is something new in the Brazilian economy because during the Lula government they were able to maintain consumer buying at a fairly high level with various tax reductions, etc. Industrial production was up 2.5% year on year in November last year, which was seen as a new spurt in the industrial production monthly series. Unemployment is very, very low, down to 5.2% in November of last year, perhaps one of the lowest rates of unemployment in recent history in Brazil. Average salaries have increased, and the economy has put a very strong demand for certain type job skills, and some professional job skills have had to be imported from other countries. Selic is our basic interest rate set by the central bank, which is now down from a high of 12.5% to now 11%. And perhaps next week the central bank might reduce it to 10.5. We're not sure, but perhaps. Well, I've done a few projections for from December 2011 through January 2012 and beyond, looking a little bit ahead to what might be happening in Dilma's second year. Some ministers should step down to run for mayor. Stepping down means you resign your executive post up till the 1st of April, 6 months before the election. Stepping down is very hard to understand in the U.S. because we don't have that, nor do they have stepping down in most European countries. The idea is that you will use your executive post to further your election, which is a good idea. Haddad, who's the education minister, PT, supposedly will be stepping down to become candidate for the mayor of Sao Paulo. And Aloysio Mercadante, who's also PT, who is currently the science and technology minister, supposedly or reportedly will switch over and be Minister of Education. And then that raises the question, who would be put in to the Science and Technology Ministry? Perhaps the PSB, the Brazilian Socialist Party, which is one of the strong allies of the PT in government. Fernando Bezerra, who is PSB, is the Minister of National Integration, and he is expected to step down to become a candidate for the mayor of Recife. However, he has received recently some corruption accusations in the press about the distribution of budget amendments within his ministry and nepotism. Some people feel that this is friendly fire related to the election in Pernambuco, but no one knows who would be his replacement at the Ministry of Integration. Idani Lopes is PT. She is the National Secretary for Women's Affairs, which is a cabinet-level position, and she will resign to become candidate for Mayor of Vitória, the capital of Espírito Santo. Now, this ministry might be preserved, let's say, not eliminated. There are several small non-portfolio, without portfolio ministries which may be eliminated or reintegrated into other larger ministries. But because Dilma is our first woman president, there's very heavy pressure for this ministry not to be downgraded. Other ministers might be replaced. Labor Minister Paulo Roberto Pinto, PDT, he's an interim minister who took over after the labor minister was forced to resign last month. Now, there might be the MTPS, the Ministry of Labor and Social Security, might be recreated, and labor might be integrated with Social Security, perhaps. The Ministry of the Cities, which is a ministry which was put together with a huge budget for developing the cities, with units and agencies from several ministries. I don't know, 10 or 12, 13, 14 years ago. Negro Monchi is the deputy from Bahia. He's PP, and so he will be replaced. He's had a number of corruption accusations as well. And this ministry might be dismembered and its units sent back into the original ministries. The Minister of Culture, Ana Holanda, who is Chico Buarque's sister, who is not formally a member of the PT but is linked to the PT, is cited in the press as probably being a candidate for replacement. Two other candidates for replacement are the Ministry of Agrarian Development, Alfonso Florence from Bahia, PT, who the press cites as a possible candidate for replacement. The Emijiki, which is the Ministry of Development, Industry, Commerce, and Foreign Trade, Fernando Pimentel, who's PT from Minas Gerais, is a possibility for replacement because recently he received accusations of illicit enrichment while he was a consultant before he became minister in Dilma's cabinet. He was one of Dilma's colleagues and companions during the guerrilla activities in the late 60s and early 70s. So they are very, very close friends. This also includes friendly fire from Minas Gerais as well. So we're not sure how that's going to work out. Now, several other cabinet ministries may lose status as a full cabinet ministry without portfolio. Fishing probably will be stuck back into agriculture. The Minister for Ports, which is PSB, may be reintegrated into the Transportation Ministry. The Secretariat for Women's Affairs, if it loses its status, it would go back to the Justice Ministry, but I say probably not. The Human Rights position might be stuck back into justice as social equality as well. Two ministries occupied by people from the PT. Strategic Affairs, occupied by Moreira Franco, PT Rio, might be stuck back into the Ministry of Planning. And Tourism, which is occupied by one of Sarney's boys, might be reintegrated back into Emijiki. But in this cabinet reshuffle, which everyone thought was going to occur now in January and probably will occur in February, I would assume after Carnival, would in some way have to accommodate the new PSD party in a cabinet position, which no one knows exactly how that will be operationalized. What to watch for in 2012? First, municipal elections in October this year. The press in Brazil has projected that because of Dilma's success and recognition and approval rating as our first woman president, this might stimulate the election of more women to municipal office, mayor and city council. Hopefully that will happen. We'll have to wait and see. The PT is in a phase to attempt an accommodation with its allied parties. This is a task that Lula had begun before he was diagnosed with cancer in his larynx, and his recuperation is going quite well, so that he might return to this role of trying to articulate things among the allied parties with the PT in March. The PMDB, which is the main ally of the PT in government, will compete head-to-head with the PT, supposedly in 14 of the 26 state capitals. This is a big change. In 2008, these two parties only competed in 8 capital cities. The PSB, the Brazilian Socialist Party, probably will expand its coverage in municipalities in 2012. And this party is an up-and-coming party that we should watch carefully. Eduardo Campos is the president of this party, and he's the governor, two-term governor of Pernambuco. And as some of you might know, he's the grandson of Miguel Arraes. The PSDB the Democrats and the PPS, former Communist Party of Brazil, the three major opposition parties, might decline in the municipal elections. We'll have to watch that very closely. Because in Brazil, we have a sequence. If from 2012 to, let's say, to 2014, expansion at the municipal level, that means parties that elect more mayors and more city council members, usually will elect more deputies 2 years later. This would be in 2014, and vice versa. If a party elects less people at the municipal level, probably that party will elect less deputies, fewer deputies, in the next general election. Finalization of some legislation. I remembered the Forest Code, which is under deliberation, the new petroleum law, which has to do with distribution of royalties, is also an important item on the agenda, and a new law which would regulate how the World Cup will be operationalized in 2014 and the Olympic Games in 2016. Foreign affairs. As some of you probably know, Dilma probably will visit Washington, D.C. in March, 2 months from now. In June, Rio de Janeiro will host this large environmental protection conference called Rio Plus 20. That means the first one was held in Rio in 1992. Brazil is also very interested in the evolution of the G20 and the financial and economic debate of the world crisis. How to solve the European, in quotes, problem related to the reform of the IMF and the World Bank to give emerging countries a greater voting weight in these two international agencies. And also what our Minister of Finance calls currency warfare, which is another subject on the agenda of the G20. We also look to what's going to be the UN decisions regarding Syria and Iran, in human rights investigations, the Iranian nuclear program, and perhaps votes in the UN, especially in the Security Council, on increased sanctions, possible sanctions. Well, that's a quick rundown of what happened with Dilma in 2012 and 2011 and what we might expect would happen in the evolution into 2012. So I thank you for your attention. Thank you very much.
David forgot to mention that the law that will regulate the World Cup thing, we will not name the winner, but you probably know. Chris, please.
You can go. Just click there.
Okay. There you are.
Awesome. Thanks. Well, first of all, I'd like to thank Paulo for the opportunity to participate in this event. As always, it's a very rich and fruitful debate and discussion. What I wanted to do here today, evidently, is along the theme of the panel today, talking about what conclusions we can extract from Dilma Rousseff's first year in office and outlook for the future, but try to do so in a context where we can nestle what's going on in Brazil with the current global environment, right? And evidently, many investors and analysts, all eyes are on Europe, U.S., China. The outlook for global growth has deteriorated markedly over the past 4 months. And one of the things that we at Eurasia Group are starting to think a little bit more about, and Eurasia Group is a political risk advisory firm, is to try to think through, what are the policy repercussions and political repercussions of a more negative global growth outlook in a potential scenario where Europe is headed to a prolonged recessionary environment, if not, we're very much not of the view that the euro is headed to a breakup, but nevertheless, it'll be a slower growth environment. And what does that mean for the large emerging market economies who have been, in great measure, driving global growth to a greater extent? And when we look across most of the countries in the emerging market space, there's a strong case to be made that the policy environment in Brazil probably will not deteriorate. In other words, that what we're probably going to see is an administration that is going to be able to navigate this more difficult global environment better than most people are anticipating. And let's remember that 1 year ago, when we were talking about the outlook for Dilma Rousseff's administration, the predominant view was one in which everyone agreed that Dilma Rousseff would keep the parameters of economic policy making that had characterized the 8 years in office of President Luiz Inácio Lula da Silva in terms of the commitment to low inflation, fiscal discipline, and so forth. But there was a latent concern that the quality of policy making would deteriorate. The view at the time and concern at the time was that Dilma Rousseff is a little bit less pragmatic than Lula. She is more ideologically driven, more leftist, more committed to a heavier role of the state in the economy. And even though we weren't going to see any backsliding in a material fashion, maybe that some of the concerns that the quality of policymaking would deteriorate, that was really at the order of the day. What we've seen, however, in her first year in office is clearly demonstrate that was not the case. Dilma Rousseff is more pragmatic than her pundits had given her credit. She is fiscally more conservative than Lula. I think there's a strong case to be made on that front. Yes, she is committed to a heavy role of the state in the economy, but she has demonstrated a penchant and a pragmatism in dealing with the private sector when necessary. And I think that one of the shining developments in her administration early in her term was a decision to privatize two of Brazil's largest airports in Brasilia and São Paulo, and also in Campinas, in putting up concessions. So aggressively turning to the private sector to overcome the country's infrastructure bottlenecks. And evidently, of course, giving continuity to the industrial policy before. But nevertheless, I think there was a pragmatism there. And what I'd like to argue today is that we're probably going to have continuity to that pragmatism in years to come. Now, in that sense, I do think that the initial hook of the conference that Paulo at least presented to us, how do we explain Rousseff's approval ratings, high approval ratings, despite the negative economic news, this is a very important element of the equation over the next 3 or 4 years. Right? Because in a context where global growth may be lower and the potential for economic growth also lower in the emerging market space, there is a reasonable case to be made that incumbents across the board, even in the emerging market space, will have a more difficult road ahead over the next 3 years in comparison to the past 3 years. Right? So what I want to do is just give my quick view on the phenomena about Rousseff's approval ratings, talk about why it's important, and then relate that to the agenda going forward. I think that, David provided the numbers of the approval ratings, quite extensively and accurately. I think my first point, however, I wanted to make is that even though Rousseff's approval ratings are high by historical standards, she is no Lula. I think, many times, I think that, there's a natural comparison that look at how Dilma Rousseff, her approval ratings she began her term in office at a higher level in comparison to all of Brazil's recent presidents. That is absolutely correct on the one hand, but it's also important to remember that over the past 5 years, Brazil has experienced an economic transformation and boom that has been unparalleled in Brazil's recent history. So if you look at, for example, these are the presidential approval ratings. Of the blue line is the sum of excellent and good. The green line is regular, and the red line is the sum of bad and horrible. So this is approval ratings on a 5-point scale. So this takes Lula's second mandate. He began his second mandate of approval ratings of around 50%. And that's when the economic takeoff really began. And we had close to 50 million Brazilians entering into the middle class. Real wages grew significantly. Purchasing power, the extent of economic optimism that occurred with the economic boom was significant, led to an average approval ratings of anywhere from 60 to the high 70s. Right? So Dilma assumes office in a context of an overheated economy and economic optimism at historic levels. Right? The drop that we had in the sum of excellent good from 80 to mid-50s occurred only because the person in the president's office changed. Right? In other words, that Lula, his approval ratings were driven by economics, yes, but he had a degree of political capital that superseded the mere economic cycle. So his own persona was equivalent to economic well-being. And so what we saw with Rousseff coming to office is that voters and the public started to evaluate a president as a mere mortal, as another human being, and on their real economic conditions. So I take a little bit of issue with some of the comparisons that I often see in the press, suggesting that Rousseff's approval ratings are higher than when Lula began. Therefore, the implicit assumption is that her political capital is as equal to or higher than Lula's. I think that is a complete misread. All right? Because Lula, at the beginning of his first mandate, assumed in a context where the economy was going through a crisis. In 2006, the economy was also through a slowdown, right? And the economic conditions that Rousseff assumed are completely different. But that does not mean that she has low approval ratings. No, she has high approval ratings, right? But she's no Lula. Second point here. So what explains the fact that her approval ratings have remained remarkably stable throughout the entire year? I think that a couple of reasons. Number one, even though we've had an economic slowdown from 7.5% to close to 3%, it's important to highlight something that David highlighted in his presentation, which is that the labor market has remained quite active. Unemployment is at historic lows. Real wages have continued to increase. And that's exactly why inflation is higher. Service inflation is very high, in part because wages have continued to increase. So the sense of economic well-being has not really dropped significantly this past year. So I think that explains number one. Number two, what we've seen over the past 3 to 4 months is the government always harping on the fact that in the context where things are going bad in Europe, we have to tighten our belts, we have to take difficult decisions, and voters aren't stupid. I mean, I think the public understands that if they start to feel a tightening of or at least some of the boundless optimism that we had in 2010 is slackening off a bit, I don't think that the public immediately blames Rousseff because of it, right? And the third phenomenon, I think that this is something that Paulo talked about, but I do think that she is tapping into, that she is a president that has the right profile for the new middle class. And if I would say that there's one, let's say transformation in the Brazilian political landscape over the past 4 or 5 years, has been this emergence of a new middle class, 50 million Brazilians entering out of the C class, or at least to the D and E classes to the C class. And that is going to change the face of politics in Brazil. If you do polls in Brazil about 5, 6 years ago, and you ask, what are your main concerns? The answers will always have to do with employment and income in some form or fashion. You ask voters today, what are your more important concerns? All right? It's education, health, and crime. Why? Now that you have your job guaranteed, you as a low-income family, your time horizon starts to get longer. You're not as immediately concerned about being able to go to the supermarket and purchase meats and other products, and losing your job. Now you're worried about the quality of health care for your family. You're worried about the quality of education for your kids. You can buy stuff. You don't want it to get stolen. Crime, right? So these are going to be the new issues of Brazilian politics. And that means that the requisites for political success for not only Rousseff, but also future presidents will increasingly be to deliver quality of public services to the new middle class and not merely deliver growth. Right? Now, this leads us back to one of her important challenges, right? Because what it means is that the demands of delivering to the new middle class are going to start to clash with the requisites of coalition management. Because, as all of you who follow Brazil know, Brazil is a multi-party presidential democracy. The way that you garner support in Congress is by distributing cabinet posts to allies in Congress, right? And what that means is that the quality of management of different ministries, you pay a cost for that, because you're not nominating ministers according to technocratic competence. You're nominating ministers in order to gather support in Congress. Well, now, for you to be able to remain popular, you're going to have a good education policy. You're going to have a good health policy. You're going to have a good communications policy to develop a national broadband plan to be able to bring internet to the new middle class. In other words, that the premium and opportunity cost of distributing cabinet posts to political allegiances is growing, right? And one of the fascinating phenomena, new phenomena of this administration, is that Rousseff started to squeeze her traditional allies and put people with more technocratic competence, or people who are loyal to her, in key ministries. She took away the Ministry of Health from the PMDB. put someone who was very close to her. She took away the Ministry of Communications from the PMDB and put Paulo Bernardo, who's also a close ally with technocratic competence, because these are key ministries to deliver in this new middle class. And so what I think is happening with this wave of corruption scandals and the different response that Rousseff has given to these corruption scandals is two things. One, I think, is her personality, that is a technocrat, that she wants to get things done. But the other thing is that she's using this as an opportunity to try to increase the premium on technocratic and quality management in the public sector. But that comes at a cost, because when you start doing that, that starts to generate disloyalty amongst your allies, right? And that's the balancing act that she's had from a political space in her first year in office, right? So that's why I think her approval ratings are a key political factor to keep an eye on. Because in a context where she's trying to squeeze her allies in government, and where she doesn't have the same political capital that Lula does, everything that's holding together is her high approval ratings and the consensus in the political class she's going to get reelected in 2014. Right? So I do think that the trajectory of these approval ratings are critical, at least from a strict political perspective. Now, particularly because, what is the economic agenda going forward? This economic agenda going forward, at least the game plan of this administration, is not necessarily an easy one. Before talking here about the reforms I put on, but the big picture here from a macroeconomic perspective is that that when the economic environment in Europe started to deteriorate and everyone started rationing down their growth projections, the immediate question that policymakers ask themselves is, well, what room do we have in order to be able to try to re-stimulate growth should a global economic slowdown have ripple effects in the emerging market space? And Rousseff's administration's diagnosis, or at least the policy response and strategy that was adopted, is, this is going to be a window of opportunity for Brazil to finally bring interest rates down. Right? I mean, if you look at the emerging market space, what we've seen is that a lot of the governments that responded to the 2008-2009 crisis, they increased spending and they cut interest rates. Right? And so the dilemma that we live today is that if, in fact, Europe enters into a much more negative environment, the room for countercyclical economic policy responses from other emerging market countries is diminished in comparison to 2008-2009. Brazil is different in that regard. Brazil is the only country of the large emerging markets that interest rates are still sky high, 11%. And so the idea within government and Rousseff's administration is, in contrast to 2008-2009, instead of increasing spending, what we should do is to try to hold spending growth back, to reduce inflationary pressures, take pressure off of the central bank so that it opens up room for the central bank to cut interest rates more aggressively. If you do that, that'll kill two birds with one stone. Not only do you generate conditions for higher growth, but you also eliminate one of the main things that are keeping policymakers awake at night in Brasilia, which is a strengthening of the real and the diminished competitiveness of industry, because high interest rates attracts foreign portfolio inflows to Brazil to make up for that carry trade. But that agenda is not easy. It's not easy for you to try to be able to roll back or at least restrain spending growth in an environment where everybody's starting to spend more, and also where you have allies demanding for more and more spending. Right? But what we're seeing is that Rousseff is actually holding the line. Of course, the big challenge for her is that she made a number of commitments that will lead to more spending in 2012 she can't roll back on. She's going to increase the minimum wage by 14%. She gave 20 billion reais worth of tax breaks to industry as part of the industrial policy program. And she has to start spending more on investments, right, in preparation for the World Cup. But what we're seeing is that outside of some of those key commitments, she's taken an extremely hard line of rejecting any petition for increase in salaries from the public sector. She's probably going to keep spending on investments to a minimum, at least a very marginal increase. And on the reform agenda, she's starting to push for a pension reform for new entrants to the public sector, which will signal fiscal responsibility over the long term. Right? In a context where fiscal dominance is really the name of the game, this kind of spending restraint, I think, is remarkable. It's at least particularly from expectations. And even though it may not be enough to give the central bank enough room in order to be able to cut interest rates aggressively, at least it is a more difficult agenda to do so. And if she does show that fiscal restraint, I think Brazil could be one of the few countries that, in a more negative global outlook, there is room to at least do a little bit more countercyclical economic policy on that front. Now, that macroeconomic agenda will probably come hand in hand with a very sector-heavy agenda. And here I think that this I would like to end on, at least the other note to call attention to, is that what we've seen in Brazil over the past 5 years as well, with this economic boom of sorts, is really the return of industrial policy. That even though, of course, and this is some of the things that really worry investors a bit, is that even though Dilma Rousseff is showing pragmatism and fiscal restraint in the manner in which I talked about here, but what we have seen is that with economic growth has been a refound commitment in Brasilia in order to be able to develop local industries, right? And in a context where the currency has been appreciating over the past 4 or 5 years, the real has appreciated close to 40%. That is really generating a lot of concern that the competitiveness of the industrial park is diminishing. So what we're going to see with, on the one hand, is the government trying to generate conditions for lower real interest rates on the one hand, but also a lot of sector-specific policies that are going to try to incent local production, not only with more aggressive local content rules, but also potentially with some protectionist measures. So if you look at the reform agenda in Congress, what do we have? Not only on the structural and fiscal reform, but what we have the oil royalty distribution law is important because you need to approve that in order to be able to implement the new exploration production framework to develop the pre-salt, which, again, there's a huge industrial policy program attached to it. The government is also going to formulate a new mining code to do an overhaul of the mining code, not only to raise taxes, but also to conduct industrial policy to incent greater value-added production in Brazil, in the mining sector. We're also going to get probably foreign land ownership restrictions approved, in addition to the ruling that the government came out with last year, which is a big problem, particularly in a context where a lot of Asian investors are coming in and purchasing Brazilian land. And finally, the government's going to make a decision on how to renew concessions in the power sector. 15% of the power generation park are going to expire in 2015, and so you have to find a way. So you look at a lot of the focus of the government outside of the macroeconomic fiscal side, which I highlighted, will be very sector specific, right? And I think that you can make the larger point that, well, for Brazil to earnestly lower interest rates, they would have to conduct a very aggressive fiscal reform to cut spending. That's not in order, so Brazil probably won't be there, yes. In order to be able to make industry more competitive, you probably would have to, again, do structural economic reforms to roll back the rigidity of Brazil's budget cycle, to generate conditions to lower spending and thus lower the tax burden. Yes, that's true. But in a context where Brazil is facing no market pressure due to fiscal solvency issues, and things have been going so well economically, and the president is so well approved, it's extremely difficult to do structural economic reforms. But within that parameter, I think that her pragmatism on economic policy is going to supersede expectations. And so from that perspective, I do think that even though we're not going to see a sea of roses in terms of what to expect, in terms of what she can deliver on the economic and policy front, I do think it's better what people feared, and probably better in a comparative perspective, particularly if you look at other countries out there like India, Russia, South Africa, going through all the political difficulties and let's say, stalemate that we're seeing on the policy environment. Thank you very much.
So let's see now from the perspective of the private sector, people that deal daily representing interests of the private sector. And I'd like to ask Kelly Mayman to be the first to speak on that topic. You speak from there?
I'll just leave from here. Okay. It's all right. Thank you, Paula, for the opportunity to speak here today. And it's a double-edged sword to follow David and Christopher. It's very, very hard because they absolutely are so comprehensive that there's nothing left to say. It's also very good because then you can just talk about what you want to talk about, which is I'll just share with you kind of some of my thoughts and musings. But excellent, excellent presentations, and agree with everything that they've both laid out there. I mean, I think as I look at why Dilma's been so popular, and understanding that she's not Lula, very few people are. For me, more than 50% of economics is psychology, and economics tends to drive political approval ratings in most countries, including in Brazil. And in this case, while obviously you've got the global environment not being as good as it could be, you've got all the fears of deindustrialization, et cetera. The overall feeling in Brazil does tend to be one of optimism. And I agree with what Christopher said about the skill set of President Rousseff being really a perfect fit for both the growing middle class and also for the growing needs of the country from an infrastructure standpoint, et cetera. I think that if you look at what is coming next in 2012, that some of the challenges that she'll confront, in my own view, a new figure that came out that made me think of this was the IBGE, the statistics agency, came out with figures saying that the favelas, the number of Brazilians living in favelas at this point in time, has doubled in the last 5 years. Now, that's not necessarily a statistic that shows that there's more poor people. It shows, as has happened in other times of heated growth in the Brazilian economy during the military regime, et cetera, that a lot of people are moving to the cities to try to take advantage of that opportunity. But what it does is it creates, to all the points that Christopher made in his presentation, it does create quite a bit of pressure on Dilma Rousseff and on her administration to deliver all the things that Christopher talked about: education, health care, infrastructure, clean water, et cetera, in a way that, because that growth wasn't there and those pressures weren't necessarily there, at least of such fast growth in the past, that's a little bit new. And you still do have 55% of Brazilians in what would be classified as the lower middle class. So you've got a real need to address the social issues and the infrastructure issues that are facing those publics in a very, I would argue, holistic way. I mean, I've had Brazilian friends joke with me that the previous politics towards the favelas was, right before an election, you'd say, oh, well, we're going to provide you with clean water. Boom, you get clean water for the election in 2012. 2014 rolls around. Well, it's an election, so we're going to give you guys electricity. Not holistic, just opportunistic. I'm going to give you, throw you a bone so you vote for me and move on. I would argue that that's not going to work in today's Brazil with a larger middle class, and certainly with this doubling of a population that already provides quite a bit of pressure, if you will, socially. So it does, I think, force a more holistic view. I do think that President Rousseff, just given her managerial personality that she's shown on so many occasions, I do think that taking a holistic approach to those problems is something that will be natural for her. But I do see this, now that the middle class is in such a good relative position vis-a-vis the past, something that I muse about or think about that I haven't seen a lot of people talk about is, what happens if during those 3 years that Christopher talked about of particular pressure on emerging market leaders due to the external environment, what if those stresses create a situation that, for whatever reason, causes some sort of a backsliding in the standard of living or an inability to deliver these social needs? And what does that, what social dynamic, what political dynamic does that create for President Rousseff going forward? And I think now, I've worked on Brazil a long time. I know Brazil is not Chile. It's the size of a neighborhood in Sao Paulo. I know the drill. But I do think that but these educational, manifestações that they've been having in Chile, I actually think are kind of interesting, because when you look, you think Chileans, they don't do manifestações. They're, very, quiet and serious. This isn't really with their political culture. But if you look at who's doing it, I mean, you have more people going to university right now in Chile because their middle class has been bigger for a little bit longer. This is their first time. They're the first person in their families to go to university. So it creates a really different social dynamic when you feel like you are, and I think this is true for most societies, when you feel like you're entitled something, when you feel like you've been, you've got your foot in the door, and then if for whatever reason that door gets shut on you, even just a little bit, I think that it just kind of, as I think about, what's next in Brazil, that's, I think, one of my, I don't want to say biggest worries, but it's something I think about a lot, is kind of what happens with that middle class if things backslide at all, and how does President Rousseff, given that she's not the rock star of Lula politically, charismatically, but that she is a good administrator, how does she manage that? And I do think bring it to the private sector, since that's what Paolo wanted me to focus on a bit. I'll get a little bit on my soapbox here, but I do think that this is an area where there is a really great opportunity for collaboration between the Brazilian government, the Brazilian private sector, and the United States private sector. Given that on a lot of these issues, providing these holistic infrastructure solutions, et cetera, these are areas where there's a lot of good, technology and know-how on the part of a lot of U.S. companies. There's a lot of need and a lot of local know-how on the part of the Brazilian economy. And so if you can bring those two things together in a meaningful way, that can be pretty powerful. And you've seen companies, you mentioned Adriana with GE. GE just announced last year that they're putting a massive R&D center, one of only 5 they have in the world, in Rio de Janeiro. IBM also is putting an R&D center there as well. So you see, big, important, U.S. companies, localizing really their R&D to be sure that they aren't just, coming in as the gringos, but to be sure that they are local, that they are, working in the local environment, and they're trying to come up with these holistic solutions that are going to be useful and be important, not just for these infrastructure solutions for the middle class, but also, being able to exploit the pre-salt in a meaningful way, which is another area where we really need to be partnering, et cetera. And, one area, picking up again on some things that Christopher talked about, definitely see in that context the return of economic or industrial policy. And I would almost argue almost an economic nationalism of, wanting to take advantage of this moment, a fear of deindustrialization driving a lot of it, a fear of China driving a lot of it, that I think, again, is looking at the trajectory over these coming years that, where there are going to be some rough waters in the external environment. That would be one area where I guess I'm not a huge fan of industrial policy, whether it's us doing Buy America or anything else anywhere else, because I do tend to think that if you just having worked on as many different cases and investments and such as I have, if you the best bet always tends to be, and people want, as Christopher said, there's so much money going into Brazil right now. People want to invest in Brazil. If the environment is open and the environment is conducive to putting more there, people will. And so, I guess I would tend to think that as opposed to, although I understand the political temptation, we do the same thing here, as opposed to taking the sectoral approach, taking, again, a bigger picture approach and really putting forward, a more ambitious, getting at some of those, again, hard to do when you're popular, as Christopher said, but getting at some of those really structural reforms that are really going to shake things up and open opportunities up, frankly, for additional private sector investment. I tend to think that will help, much, much more than going the other way. One other point that I'll make that I do think is important that we touched upon with respect to the social, needing to address the social needs of the middle class, and that is education and educated workforce. I do think that, as companies do increase, particularly with their higher tech, these R&D investments in Brazil, that is going to continue to be a real need to be a real focus. One of the programs that I'm really excited about of President Rousseff is the Science Without Borders program. It has both a private sector element and a public sector element. I think that that's a clear recognition that in order for those sorts of investments to succeed, the workforce issues are going to have to be addressed, and that the best way to address them is in partnership, because quite frankly, what a lot of companies are already doing in and of their own, because again, they want to be in Brazil, is if they can't get the folks there in the market, they're doing their own training programs and such internally already, which is interesting because if you go back, again, talking about GE, if you go back to the 1950s, I don't know how many of you have read any corporate histories of GE or anything like this, but you'll hear about Crottonville, which is their corporate training center in Connecticut, where it's, the holy grail. Everyone goes there to get training, and, back in the day would, sit at the knee of Jack Welch and drink from the font of wisdom. But the whole reason that Crotonville came into being in the 1950s was because we didn't have enough universities that had MBA programs. And so GE said, what the heck, we're going to set up our own training center. So it's kind of, I think it's a natural progression, and I think that addressing those questions of education and making sure that you're able to seize the moment by having the right workforce, by having the right economic policies, by being open to partnering with foreign companies, be it U.S. or whoever, I think that that's all very important. I'm going to, just because China is always kind of sitting in the room, and again, I'll get on my soapbox just a tiny bit, but I know a lot of folks have been talking about, in this relationship between private sector and the U.S. private sector, and Brazil, talking about, China's a new element, and the Chinese are coming investing so much, and the Indians are coming investing so much. The central bank brought out some figures at the end of the year in December that, for me, I actually got kind of surprised. They were super interesting, saying that the current stock of U.S. foreign investment in Brazil is $105 billion. The current stock of Chinese foreign investment right now in Brazil, $8 billion. And I personally thought it would be more. They're in 16th place. They're behind Mexico. They're behind Canada. And so, I think that almost makes the point that I was making a bit before about, the fact that, whatever's happening between our countries politically, I think that at least what I see right now is an incredibly dynamic and incredibly deep and incredibly rich relationship between our private sectors and with respect and both ways. Certainly the number of Brazilian companies that have taken advantage of the weak dollar and, let's be honest, in the current environment here economically, some fire sale prices, to invest here in the United States, that is a relatively new phenomenon over the last 10 years or so. It also means that you have Brazilian companies for the first time being pretty important economic stakeholders here in the United States, and oh my gosh, creating the J-word jobs, which is super duper important in an election year. So I think that there's, you've got that aspect of it. And you also have the fact that, and right now I'll segue because I know Paolo's going to probably ask me about this anyway in the Q&A, so I'll just cut to the chase. But on the Dilma trip, which, as David mentioned, is hopefully going to take place in March, there's a lot of debate going, back and forth, or misunderstanding going back and forth as to, is it going to be a state visit? Is it not going to be a state visit? I mean, my own personal view is that I think it should be a state visit, my own personal view, for a variety of reasons, economic and geopolitical. But, if because it's an election year it can't be, I hope that because this economic agenda, this opportunity, which also does, dovetail with a lot of what President Rousseff needs to get done economically, politically, I would love to see some sort of an agenda sewn together that would be, perhaps very heavy on the economic side of it. Of course, I'm biased because that's where I play. But I do think that there's some great stories to tell that, quite frankly, aren't getting a lot of airtime at this point in time. And from a U.S. domestic political standpoint, yes, it's an election year, but Brazil is, and of course, this doesn't play very well in Brazil, but Brazil is one of the few markets where we have a surplus. And if you look at, I just mapped out the states that are the top export states to Brazil. Think about how many electoral votes are in these states. Although most U.S. voters I know don't think about international affairs, but still, I don't think you're going to hurt yourself. New York, California, Florida, Louisiana, Illinois, Indiana, Ohio, and Pennsylvania. So there's, just to kind of, probably beat the dead horse on the point, but there's really a lot going on between our countries economically that I do think we, can continue to build on, we can continue to take advantage of, and that apropos to the theme of Paolo's topic today, I think can also, particularly if our private sectors can partner on some of these social issues, exploiting the pre-salt, et cetera, can also really work to President Rousseff's benefit with respect to her agenda as well, and popularity. So thank you.
Thank you, Kelly. And now we're going to hear from Diego. Diego, you'd prefer to speak from there? Okay.
That's fine. Thank you, Paulo. I don't know if there is much left to say at this point. I'll try basically to supplement some, give some additional thoughts on thinking the business, taking the business perspective of the first year of President Rousseff, and thinking mainly about two aspects: domestic economy and U.S.-Brazil relations. So, in terms of domestic economy, the question would be why business people like Dilma despite bad news? And I think that the business sector in Brazil, particularly the manufacturing sector, is so far happy with the Rousseff administration, because there was, at least in 2011, a focus and a really strong effort from the part of the administration to appease the manufacturing sector. And I use this word appease because I'm not sure if this set of policies will work in this year, in the coming years. But the fact is that with the rebirth of the industrial policy, as Chris said, the administration really tried to deploy a number of policies to help the private sector, in particular the manufacturing piece of it. And while the administration was pursuing this new industrial policy, the administration was also trying not to upset the political pact that President Lula built in 2002, that to some extent allow him to win the election. And that means that do your industrial policy, but don't change that much the economic policy in place. So you can help the manufacturing sector, but you can't upset the balance or the pact that you have with the financial groups, with the banks, mainly from the state of São Paulo. So I think that was, in terms of domestic economy, in terms of the business perspective, that was what happened in 2011. And the reasons for this so-called appeasement, I think there are at least two. There is one that I call a strategic reason. I think that the Rousseff administration operates very much in a conceptual framework that people in Brazil, or at least the press in Brazil, call the neo-developmentist thinking, which is basically, I'll portray it basically as a persistent myth that you have in Brazil, that you can only generate growth and create jobs if you focus your policies on industrialization and protection. So you can only grow if you have protection. This is a very persistent myth in Brazil that was probably generated in the period of the coffee plantations in the early 20th century, and still is very much in the minds of the policymakers, both in the left and in the right, and in the minds of a number of business leaders in the country. So there is this thinking in the administration on one hand. So this is one reason why the administration put a great emphasis on trying to appease the manufacturing sector or support the manufacturing sector. And the other one, of course, is a tactical reason. The administration was spent 2011 trying to offset the political effects of the economic crisis, while roughly trying to maintain the economic model that was inherited in place. So everything that Chris already mentioned, you have a strong overvalued real on one hand, you have the Chinese economic policy on the other. That generated a huge tsunami of imports in the Brazilian market, in third countries, traditional export markets to Brazil, and that really created a problem for the manufacturing sector. So there is a lot of talk in the country about deindustrialization, and at the same time, there is a concern of Brazil losing its space in key export markets when it comes to high value-added products. And this is particularly the case of the U.S. So if you look at the numbers of the bilateral trade between Brazil and the U.S., you can see that consistently, at least since 2003, 2004, there is a trend of growing exports of natural resources or basic products instead of manufacture high value-added products. And this is very consistent. So these are the two reasons that I see that that are behind the administration effort to appease the manufacturing sector, while again not upsetting the links with the financial groups. And to do that, I think that the administration basically used two sets of tools. So in terms of economic means, there were at least four means that were used to appease the manufacturing sector. The major one, of course, was the launching of the Bigger Brazil Industrial Policy. So the policy was launched on August last year by President Rousseff herself. I don't know if you have a copy of this. There are copies outside of the room. This is basically a list of all the different measures that are part of the Bigger Brazil Industrial Policy. And if you look at that, you will see that the bulk of the Bigger Brazil Industrial Policy is actually trade policy. And it's pretty much focused on import administration on one hand and export subsidies on the other. So there are a number of measures that include, reduction of trade remedies investigation time, increasing the fighting of under-invoicing, raising import tariffs, and then on the export subsidy side, you have a number of new BNDES programs. You have, efforts to try to eliminate residual taxation on exports and so on and so forth. But the issue is that there was this effort by the Brazilian government to put in place a substantial industrial policy. That was the first tool that was employed. At the same time, the government pursued. The government had this effort to consistently reduce the interest rate, and Chris again mentioned that before. And that, of course, interest rate is probably number one priority for the manufacturing sector in the country for the last 20 years at least. So that played nice with the business people. The third element in terms of economic means for the appeasement was also an effort to accelerate infrastructure investments. And here we have two aspects. We have the second version of the Growth Acceleration Program. So President Rousseff, when she took office, moved all the management structure of the PAC back to the Ministry of Planning, Management and Budget, and that was an effort to try to, accelerate these investments. I'm not sure if that worked, and what they are doing now is really thinking if they should go back to the old model and bring all the management of the PAC back to the Casa Civil, so closer to the president. And also there was the issue of there was the announcement of the airport concessions, and that also signaled that the administration was interested in accelerating the infrastructure investment. And the fourth element in terms of economic policy for this appeasement was the initiative of Brazil to bring the issue of currency manipulation to the World Trade Organization. So since the beginning of the year, Itamaraty has been trying to put the relationship between currency and trade into the WTO. So far, the ministry was successful in creating a small program of work in this field. And now in 2012, we'll have a number of seminars and workshops in Geneva. And the idea of the administration is to use that as a way to start discussing potential new rules in the World Trade Organization, in the WTO, about currency manipulation. Ideally, what is in the mind of the business sector, specifically on the manufacturing leaders. Ideally, Brazil would have some kind of anti-dumping or countervailing measure in place that could be used against China because of currency manipulation. So this is the end goal. But aside from these economic means for the appeasement, there are also the political means for appeasement that the administration pursued. So, first of all, President Rousseff put Fernando Pimentel as the Minister for Development, Industry, and Foreign Trade. He's a strong politician within PT, and he's a friend, as David mentioned. And, of course, he comes from Minas Gerais, which is the second largest manufacturing state in the country. She also put Aloysio Mercadante as the Minister of Science and Technology and Innovation. He's also a strong politician inside of PT, and he comes from the state of São Paulo. So you have basically two manufacturing states in the country representing the key ministries for the manufacturing sector. She also crafted an alliance with the Brazilian National Confederation of Industry, CNI. The head of CNI is historically linked to the opposition, but CNI backed the new industrial policy, although they have been already saying that it might not be enough to protect the manufacturing sector from Chinese competition in the country and in third markets. But anyway, there was this political alliance that was crafted in 2011. And I think one very interesting element is that to some extent, there was a detachment from the unions in this administration. So the unions were very present in the previous Lula administration, and right now in some areas, and particularly when it comes to the business sector, you can see that there is more distance between the administration and some of the unions. So these were I think the elements for this appeasement of the business sector. So based on that, the question is the honeymoon going to end? I think it might in 2012, and the reasons are these. First of all, the bigger Brazil industrial policy, as I said, is trade policy, is not industrial policy. So it's basically a collection of measures that were previously announced by President Lula or that have been discussed for a number of years inside of the Brazilian government, and they are, in the end, they are insufficient both in scope and depth. So you can look at the list and you'll see that the Rousseff administration intends to hire 100 new officials for the Ministry of Industry and Trade to try to come up with new anti-dumpings, but there is so many anti-dumpings you can have to try to counter the Chinese invasion. It won't work. So this is a very important aspect. So the bigger Brazil, in my view, the bigger Brazil industrial policy does not address the key competitiveness challenges that the manufacturing sector face. And also there is another element. To some extent, this industrial policy is a contradiction, because if you have a government in power, the government from the left, that is trying to expand the wealth in the base of the pyramid, growing this new middle class. How can this government try, on one hand, to do all these social policies to grow the base of the pyramid, and on the other hand, has something like the new oil policy that basically reinforces a oligopoly that has been in place in the country for the last 30 years. And so the very people that are going to buy the new cars are exactly people from this new emerging middle class. So on one hand, you have social policies to empower these people, and on the other, you take their money and give to the big oil companies. So there is, I think, a contradiction there between the industrial policy and the social policies in place. So this is the first element. The second element is that you all probably know that whenever you sit with a business leader or a head of a company in Brazil, key expression in the dialogue is the Brazil cost. So what is the Brazil cost? The Brazil cost is basically a concept that was developed by the National Confederation of Industry back in the early 90s, and the Brazil cost was created to try to align all the different groups in the private sector so that they could have a joint effort to push government towards economic reform that would help the manufacturing sector competitiveness. And there is some discussion in the universities and within the business sector of what exactly is the Brazil cost. I think that the Brazilian Machinery Builders Association has a good definition of what is the Brazil cost. There is also some information in the paper about the Brazil cost, and you can see all the different elements. So part of the Brazil cost is energy costs, logistics, cost of inputs, red tape, compliance costs, taxation, investment costs, so on and so forth. And the question that the issue that I think that the administration will face is that the administration is not very clear on what they are doing to reduce the Brazil costs for the manufacturing sector, but also for the agribusiness and for the services. And if you look at the table, you can see that in some areas it is pretty clear what the administration is doing. They are trying to reduce the cost of doing business in Brazil and invest in Brazil. So when it comes to infrastructure, there is an obvious effort, to accelerate investment. But when it comes to energy, for instance, it's not very clear. On one hand, you have all these new hydropower dams in the Amazon. They'll probably push prices down. But at the same time, the administration gives a lot of power to Petrobras that has a de facto monopoly on some areas of the energy sector. So when you look from the business perspective in the southeast of the country, which is houses the bulk of the manufacturing sector, you have Petrobras with a monopoly of gas distribution, and pushing prices up, and this is affecting the competitiveness of the manufacturing sector. So it's not very clear what the administration intends to do to help businesses there. Same with cost of inputs. On one hand, you have all these new decrees that reduce sales tax for construction materials, capital goods, other products, but at the same time, they are raising import tariffs. So you reduce on one hand, and then you put new taxes on imports. The very technology that you need to import is now more expensive. So I think that it's not very clear what the administration is doing to help business in terms of reducing the Brazil costs. And I don't think the administration will embark on what is really the key issue here. These are the constitutional reforms. Some of them were also mentioned by Chris. So taxation, labor laws, and social security. It's very hard for the administration to do that, although you have in place the largest coalition in Congress since the end of the military rule. But I think that this is very important, and I think this will be a reason for the end of this honeymoon. The business sector will more and more say that the bigger Brazil industrial policy is not enough, and they want more structural reforms. And I'm not sure if the administration have the political will and desire to pursue these reforms. And that, of course, because of the coalition building issue that you have in Brazil, but also because aside from the constitutional reforms, another thing the administration has to do, and also Chris mentioned that, is the fiscal adjustment. So there is no way for the administration to continue to reduce the interest rate without embarking in a more substantive fiscal adjustment process. And again, you have the problem of coalition building. So if you start cutting pieces of the government, then you create a problem of all the different parties. Plus, that will probably have a negative impact on public investment, and that will have a negative impact on the economy. So I think these two elements, the constitutional reforms, and they are key to reduce the Brazil costs, and the fiscal adjustment are really the hornet's nest for the Rousseff administration. And finally, when it comes to the acceleration of the infrastructure investment, you need a more efficient government in Brazil. I think that in Brazil there is another myth that whenever you have a problem, you create another ministry. So in 2006, I remember when Governor Alckmin was running for president, he proposed to create a ministry to fight drug trafficking because that was a key concern of the population. And I remember last year, both President Rousseff and Governor Serra, they met with people from the disabilities movement in Brazil, and they were complaining the federal government doesn't have a clear policy in this area, and they said, well, let's create the Ministry of People with Disability. And so there is this persistent myth of centralization, creating a centralized unit of policy making. I don't favor this, but I think that at the same time you have too many ministries in Brazil. So you should have fewer overlapping and competing decision-making units in the administration. So fewer ministries, maybe you have a good number of federal agencies, but certainly fewer ministries. There should be more structured policy-making process. The interagency coordination in Brazil is chaos. I think it is in every government, in every democracy at least. But in the case of Brazil, you have a chronic problem because of the coalition building process. So you have all these fights between the different ministries, and it's virtually impossible to come up with a consistent interagency coordination process. And of course, you need less political appointees and more career people and more efficient spending. So I think all these elements have a role when it comes to try to accelerate infrastructure investments. So I think because these are the reasons that might cause the honeymoon with the business sector to end. And finally, I just want to say a word about U.S.-Brazil relations in this context. I think that from the business perspective, I think the U.S.-Brazil relations are politically they are very good. Even with we are now past Honduras and Iran and all those things that happened in early 2010. So the political relations are very good. I think you have increasing trade and cross-border investment between the two countries, and Kelly mentioned that. So you have business taking the lead, both through M&As and greenfield investment. But you have some mixed results in terms of trade policy, trade and investment policy, because you have, on one hand, the new Brazilian industrial policy, the bigger Brazil, and on the other hand, you have persistent residual protectionism in the U.S., and for Brazil, the key one is agricultural subsidies. You all know that. But what is interesting is that in Brazil, there is always this comparison between U.S. and China. The relationship between Brazil and U.S. and the relationship between Brazil and China. And there is a perception in some people in the administration and in the business sector, really, and in the press, that the U.S. talks the talk but doesn't walk the walk, while China does. I think this is a myth. I think it's easy for when you have an authoritarian trade policy making process to come up with deliverables in presidential visits and then taking these deliverables back when it's not of your interest. In the case of the U.S.-Brazil relationship, it takes time. It's much more complex because of the nature of the two governments. But once you move, I think there is no way really to go back. And if you think about 2011, I think that was probably the best year for Brazil in the U.S. in terms of trade, at least in the last decade. In 2011, Brazil got the renewal of the GSP, the Generalized System of Preference, that benefits about 10% of Brazilian exports. Brazil got the end of the ethanol tariff and the ethanol subsidy. Brazil managed to get the cotton temporary agreement that was negotiated in 2010 in place. So the U.S. keeps sending money to Brazil as compensation and open its market for Brazilian pork as part of it. And in the end of the year, Embraer won the U.S. Air Force bid with the Super Tucano. So you have a number of very, very important achievements for Brazil. On the U.S. side, I think you have less, but you still have some bilateral agreements that were of interest to the U.S., such as the Open Skies Agreement that was signed last year, that remove barriers on air transport. You have a trade and investment framework agreement and other things. So 2012, can it be better? I think it can be much better. Have a number of potential deliverables for this year. On the U.S. side, have a definitive solution to the cotton dispute and to the orange juice dispute. Open the market for Brazilian meat. Recognize the Brazilian cachaça, which is a long-standing, request from Brazil, almost 10 years, and allow more Brazilians to come in. Put Brazil in the visa waiver program. On the Brazil side, one big thing would be for Brazil to buy the F-18s from the U.S. in the FX2 bid. More cooperation on energy in general, but in particular in nuclear energy and in the pre-salt. If Brazil is willing to have some flexibility in terms of local content, something that even Petrobras has been requesting, that will have a very positive impact and reduction, elimination some of the barriers that were created with the bigger Brazil or even before that. And finally, in terms of bilateral agreements, there is also plenty of opportunities, biofuels cooperation in third countries, including aviation biofuels, patent protection, nuclear energy, and others. Can 2012 be worse? Yes. All those things might not happen. And in addition, you would have something like Brazilian retaliation connected to the cotton dispute or to the orange juice dispute, or a recreation of the ethanol tariff. And in Brazil, Brazilians going with the Gripen instead of the F-18s, or adopting more protectionist measures. So I think it's 2012 might be better in the end for the U.S.-Brazil relationship.
Thank you, Diego. On the cachaça part, since ethanol, which is alcohol, can come with no obstacles, now you have the recognition of cachaça. If they would just end the protectionism on sugar, ice we can always provide, and you know what you can do with the four. So with that, I'd like to open for questions. Yes. I would like to ask people to identify themselves before asking short and very hard questions, please.
Peter Bogart from the German Institute of Global and Area Studies. Good that we had at the end more criticism than all the optimism. I was already swept away. So what actually are the latest figures on public infrastructure investment? My feeling is, very superficially, that very little has been done, and that is not only for soccer stadia and infrastructure of cities, but in general, still my visits showed that infrastructure is tremendously lacking. And the same issue is, what about, indeed, we talked about education of skills. Has there any progress been done, or is there been done? Do we have data on that?
Okay. Who would like to? Chris, could you take the one on
Sure.
infrastructure?
No, I think that one of the perennial challenges in Brazil certainly is to find ways of funding and capacity to increase public, spending on of public infrastructure. I mean, I think that the basic data. I mean, I don't have it exactly on the top of my head, but I think that at the beginning of Lula's administration, spending on investments, which the bulk of it are infrastructure, as a share of GDP, was close to 0.6%, which is very low by comparative standards. By the end of Lula's term, the last year of Lula's term, 2010, spending on investments as a share of GDP was 1.26% of GDP, which was equivalent to 46 billion reais. That was what we saw, I think, under Lula's term. And this is a lot of the press talks about the fact that the growth acceleration program, they didn't deliver on all their targets. But when you speak with a lot of technocrats in the various different ministries, what I think people underestimate is that, after nearly 20 years of fiscal adjustment and incapacity of the public sector to fund infrastructure projects, there just wasn't the capacity and know-how to be able to spend the money. I mean, there's a series of processes in terms of formulating projects, getting environmental regulations, dealing with all the different, the Federal Accounting Tribunal, or dealing with how you actually construct contracts to build, roads and highways. And so what we've seen, I think, over the past 6 to 7 years is an increasing in the capacity of the public sector to actually generate conditions to execute infrastructure programs. So even though the total numbers haven't actually been significant, I think it's underestimated. There's a little bit of a silent revolution going on within the public sector that is generating the basis to increase spending. Spending on infrastructure dropped this year to, it was $46 billion. Now it'll be back to $42 billion at the end of 2011. As share of GDP, it was part of the fiscal rollback. They try to cut non-essential spending. It's going to increase next year, but it's a slow and steady wins the race type of story. But is it enough? No, right? So I think that a lot of the back and forth here is that, I think that what I try to do more in my presentation is to highlight maybe what is being done on the positive side, but I fully recognize that the structural challenges for a sustained higher growth environment, or to meet all these, we're not getting enough essentially to be able to from a comparative and where a lot of people would like to get. In terms of the education, to be honest, I have less data. I follow that sector less, although, there are World Bank studies that do highlight how that even though the deficit on education remains significant in Brazil, that goes all the way from middle to higher level of education standards, that there is steady progress, going on that front as well. But it is, again, it's just seeing the glasses half full or half empty. If you compare it to the levels of investments in education you see in a lot of the Asian economies, again, or even some of their other peers in Latin America, Brazil is still falling short.
Yeah, on education, there is a one-way things are being, the urgent need for some qualified manpower in certain areas is being dealt with by open immigration. And Brazil is really approving more and more work permits for qualified manpower. It reached hundreds of thousands last year because the economy cannot wait. And Brazil being a country of immigrants, by the way, it's very easy in Brazil to do that. On infrastructure, a couple of information, for instance, there is a port, very modern port, that just it's ready to go in Santa Catarina. But because of problems of coordination, there is a road, a 23-kilometer road that was not ready at the same time. So it's a matter of months. You are going to have new capacity in that area. The same thing happening in the Amazon in the first hydro plant on the Madeira River. The first unit, turbine, is there already, ready to go. The transmission line is not in place. But I think to underline what Chris was saying, there is movement ahead in various fronts. And one of the things, listening to the presentations, that I wanted you all to have in mind, all of this is in front of the Brazilian public all the time. This is being debated, presented, discussed in newspapers, and not only there, on television, on radio. So what we are doing here is something that Brazilians listen or see and are engaged in all the time. David.
Yeah, the infrastructure bottlenecks are tremendous and are part of what we talked about, the cost of doing business in Brazil. It's not only highways and railroads and ports, but also airports, infrastructure, and energy, electricity and gas. Brazil had a very difficult time in 2001 with what we had what's called a massive national blackout, where we had to go on a rotation of blackouts nationwide. And so as of 2003 with Lula, the generation of electricity was given as a priority to try to keep ahead of the demand so you wouldn't have any more blackouts. The education area is important, and the private sector calculates that there's a deficit of about 30,000 engineers in Brazil, and engineers in various sectors, civil engineer, mechanical, electrical, etc. And there has been an importation of migration of engineers, especially from Latin American countries, but also from Europe and the United States, where there are many unemployed engineers here and also in Europe as well. To remedy this, Brazil is building a large new group of technical schools, high school level technical schools, to train middle level technical skilled manpower, and also expand some university programs in the area of engineering. What was described by Kelly in the question of GE and its training center in Connecticut, several large construction companies, especially in Sao Paulo, because of the total lack of skilled manpower in the construction industry. You're talking about bricklayers, tile layers, et cetera, et cetera. And what they did is these companies went out into the interior of Sao Paulo and found agricultural workers who were very interested in migrating to Sao Paulo, and they brought these people in off the farms and put them in industrial training programs by the construction firms themselves to train people to fill these jobs that they weren't able to fill in the job market. The job market is complicated because you have increasingly high salaries, and because the unemployment is very low, this puts very heavy pressure on salaries to maintain the recruitment of skilled people. So yes, this is a bottleneck problem, not only infrastructure but also education and skilled manpower.
Go here at the center, and then we go there.
Thank you. My name is Graciela Reyes. I am the former representative of Uruguay to the Organization of American States. We have mentioned, I have heard the changes in the cabinet of Dilma Rousseff, and my question is there a controversy referring to the amount of money that the members of the different ministers receive? I think at this moment they are questioning if they also are part of public-private enterprises and they have some type of bonus at the moment. There's quite a situation there. Will this create further problems for Dilma's administration? Thank you.
David, looks like a question for you.
PPPs have public-private participation projects have become more and more frequent in Brazil, and some of the infrastructure areas are resorting to PPPs to generate enough investment to do certain projects. The budget dispute among the ministries is very, very hot and very heavy. Each ministry wants more money. This is complicated by budget amendments which are added in by senators and deputies. Brazil has an authorization budget where the Congress authorizes the executive branch to spend. And the executive branch more or less spends the way it pleases and can freeze and liberate certain parts of the budget when the president sees fit. Not like the budget here in the U.S., which is approved by the Congress, and the president has no way of manipulating the budget or impounding anything. So there is quite heavy competition among the ministries, and the press is always doing a scorecard month by month, cabinet ministry by cabinet ministry, to see what was appropriate in the budget for that ministry and what they have been able to spend so far. And at the outset of Dilma's administration in January last year, she did across the board 50 billion real austerity budget reduction. And some ministries were very upset that they were reduced in certain areas. So yes, it is a competition, and parties dispute hotly to get a ministerial appointment because that then enhances their party's, let's say, campaign chest for the next election, unfortunately. And they have in Brazil two concepts of how you organize a cabinet ministry. One is called the closed gate, and the other is an open gate. Closed gate means that, let's say, you're a minister appointed from the PR party. So in your ministry, all the second, third, fourth, and fifth echelon positions, you appoint everyone from your party. That's the closed gate. The open gate is that the president says, okay, I'm going to appoint the number 2 in your ministry, the internal control person, et cetera, and you're not going to have a closed gate. You're going to have appointments of other people, technicians, and from other parties in your ministry. So that's also a very hotly disputed question.
Great.
Well, I was actually, when you asked the question, I'm not exactly sure what you were asking, because I thought that, because there is a controversy, another controversy as well in the public sector, which is that if you're a minister, that your salary is only limited to the president's salary, which actually, compared to the private sector, is relatively low. You know, it's 12,000 reais, or I don't know what the recent adjustment is, but it's a relatively low salary. And so a way to increase the compensation for ministers is to not only get your public sector salary, but also nominate them to be on boards of state-owned companies, like board of Petrobras, Eletrobras, and they can get a lot of money with that. So that's a way that you get around the salary restriction for the ministries by making them appointments to all these state-owned enterprises.
Supplement.
Yeah, to supplement the income. Sometimes it can be more than what you get on your regular salary. But I think that the problem, it does create issues of, you know, accountability, and is it appropriate for ministers to be on the boards of state-owned enterprises? But unfortunately, I think it's a consequence of too low of a ceiling on some of the upper echelons of the public sector, which is driven by the need to control state finances. So I don't know exactly how to get around this, but that is a dirty little secret in Brasilia that people make a lot more money than just their official salary. Yeah. But, you know, but you need to keep talent. I mean, it's tough, because how do you attract highly competent technocrats in the public sector with such a low salary? I mean, it's difficult. You need talent.
You also have accumulation. You may have a minister who has been a governor, and he has a retirement pension from being governor, which is usually more than his salary as minister. If he or she was a senator or a deputy, he has an accumulation of that pension as well. And so sometimes ministries have mega salaries because they accumulate retirement pensions from other sectors.
It's nothing new to the Dilma or the Lula government. It happened before also. It's not
Common, very common.
I think the gentleman there had a question, yes.
My name is Emerson. I'm with the University of Maryland, and one topic that I've been researching recently is corruption. And it goes to what Professor David Fletcher, introduced the topic here today with the fall of, 6, ministers in the Dilma Rousseff administration, or during that administration. My question is, do you feel or do you see that the Brazil government is becoming less tolerant of corruption? And if so, isn't that making, easier for Dilma or any future president or administration to discourage and, prevent corruption? Isn't that a positive thing, process that is going on in Brazil right now?
Yes, it is positive, and it has a very, very strong participation by the media. Brazilian journalism is very strong in investigative journalism. However, if you look at all the people over the last 5 or 6 years who have been accused of corruption and may have been kicked out of government, you will not find any, not one, who was convicted and sent to jail or had to return any of the money that was, let's say, stolen or siphoned off. So our laws and our judicial process is very, very weak in terms of looking at corruption. I tell my Brazilian colleagues a case of the most powerful man in Congress at one point, who was Dan Rostenkowski. He was the president of the Ways and Means Committee in the House. A first-level federal judge in Chicago sent this guy to jail directly. And my Brazilian friend said, well, what about réu primário? Wasn't he a first offender? Said, no, that doesn't work in the U.S. Well, wasn't he allowed to be out on bail while he appealed? No, he went straight to jail and lost his job. And so the Brazilians are very surprised at how this could work on the most powerful man in Congress. Unconceivable. Didn't he have a special means of being tried only at the Supreme Court, like in Brazil? People accused who occupy offices can only be tried, processed at the Supreme Court. For the first time in Brazilian history, 38 people involved in the mensalão are now being tried by the Supreme Court, which is unheard of, never happened before. So the problem is accountability. We have something called parliamentary immunity, which is common in Latin America, but in Brazil it's translated into parliamentary impunity.
Can I add something?
Yes, sir.
Polemic. Okay. Two aspects. I think there is an emerging role for what we call in Brazil the external control government agencies. So each branch of the government, executive, legislative, judiciary, has now an external control agency that oversees how the money is spent by these branches. And most of this structure was created in the Federal Constitution of 1988. And at the time, a lot of people didn't pay really attention to these agencies, and they thought they would never work. But what is going on, what is happening in the last 10 years, I think, is that these agencies are now much more structured, and they are really trying to get their job done. So you have the Public Ministry, the Ministério Público, you have CGU, you have now the new agency that is the external control of the judiciary, and they are putting a lot of pressure in the old way of doing politics in Brazil. So I think there is this emerging trend, and at the same time, I think there is something very interesting in Brazil, especially when you compare with the U.S., is that in Brazil there are no rules for lobbying. So there is no First Amendment that says that that each person has a right to petition the government. So it's not very clear what is lobbying and what is corruption. So whenever the press, and there is a difference between the two.
Oh, yes.
So whenever the press wants to chase someone, they say that there was a lobbyist working for this or that person. So what happened with Minister Palocci, the chief of staff of the president? He stepped down, or he was fired, because he had a lot of money with a consulting company before becoming a minister. So precisely because there is no law, you have this gray zone, and then the press starts saying, he was a lobbyist. He was a lobbyist, and a
He was a consultant.
He's a consultant, meaning he was a lobbyist. And to be a lobbyist in Brazil is a bad word, and there is no rules. So it was very hard for him to explain what exactly was going on, and because of that, he had to step down. So you have some bills in Congress. You have some serious people trying to come up with lobbying laws in the country to precisely define what is corruption. A minister that gets money from companies as bribes, and someone that stepped down, is not working for the government, has its own firm, and then comes to the government. So the problem is, I think, one of the problems is this gray zone. So everything can be labeled corruption in the country.
Just one thing.
Diego mentioned something that's extremely important, which is external control. In 2005, after 15 years that this bill had been, let's say, running around Congress, Congress approved the external control body for the judiciary branch. And of course, everyone assumes that in the judicial branch of any country, like here in the U.S., there's no corruption. Judges are not corrupt and never are, et cetera, et cetera. However, this new CNJ, which started working in 2005, began looking at corruption in the judicial branch. And they have a very courageous woman judge who is you would say, the main prosecutor investigator. And she discovered 68 judges that if you looked at their assets and compared that to their salaries, if you looked at their salaries over the last 15 years, their assets were maybe 20 or 30 times larger than the sum of their salaries. And so that's what we call in Brazil illicit enrichment. And mainly that's accepting bribes for judicial decisions. So this got very, very hot, as you might imagine. And the Association of Judges, the Association of Lawyers, et cetera, became very negative on this type of investigation. And so one of the judges on the Supreme Court issued an injunction, a stay on any future investigations by the CNJ. This judge just happens to be the first cousin of Fernando Collor, who he appointed to the Supreme Court, his first cousin. Before that, at that time, we didn't have any nepotism laws or rules, and so he issued this injunction. And this is a very important item on the agenda this year in 2012 when the judicial branch comes back after recess in February and March. The full Supreme Court is going to have to vote on this and several other important questions that the Supreme Court is going to have to decide. But don't think that corruption is only in the executive branch or only in the legislature. There is considerable, not a lot, but there is considerable corruption in the judicial branch. And she made a very ominous statement, this woman judge said, we have a lot of crooks and thieves wearing judicial robes, which, of course, many of the judges took that as an insult.
Okay, just a point of clarification. What Diego was talking about, there is, for instance, a case of Minister Pimentel. He was outside, he didn't have a public function, and he was a consultant. and some of his consulting activities became a point of controversy, probably through friendly fire, because in the face of it, she did nothing wrong. The case of Palocci, whom I personally admire for his skills as a politician, as a congressman and later for a part of the Dilma Rousseff campaign. He was a consultant. I find it absurdity that a member of Congress can be a consultant at the same time. Apparently, the Brazilian law allows that. And he made 20 million reais in a very short period of time, and then he could not explain, because people are saying, please explain publicly where the money came from. He invoked secrecy laws in order not to reveal his clients, and he was let go for that reason, in that order. But one thing that I would emphasize on this topic, see this as a video, not as a picture. This is much better. What we have now is much better than what we had 5 years ago.
Yes, yes.
You have much more, and part of what Chris was talking about, quality, the demand for quality on this new middle class is that this new middle class is much less tolerant of this type of behavior than the traditional electorate in Brazil. So, and keep doing this type of research and keep asking this type of question publicly, because that helps a lot the process.
But the problem with Palocci and Pimentel is that when they were doing this consulting in 2009, 2010, it was quite apparent that Dilma probably would be elected president. In both men were extremely close to Dilma, and everyone knew that they were going to occupy very, very important positions in her government. So that was what you would call a saleable quality.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, let's collect a few questions, 1 and 2, and whoever else, and then we have to close. Yes.
Thank you. My name is Fred Jasperson, and Paulo, given what you said about consultants, I hesitate to say it, but I'm a consultant to the IIA.
You are protected by the First Amendment, sir. Go ahead.
I have not, unfortunately, enriched myself in the process, but I wonder if there isn't an additional worry that we have to be concerned with for 2012, and that is a convergence toward stagflation in Brazil. How could we get there? Well, if we look at the third quarter of 2011, the latest quarter that we have information for, and is pointed out in the Financial Times in their feature article today on Brazil, growth was basically, didn't exist in the third quarter, basically had a flat quarter. Growth in the Brazilian economy has continued to decelerate steadily since 2010. If this continues in 2012, there's a real political question of whether or not the administration will do what it did in 2009 and 2010, which is use substantial fiscal stimulus and quasi-fiscal stimulus through the BNDES and the other state banks to not let growth come below, say, 2% or 1.5%. We do know that interest rates are coming down, and we do see that inflation has come down from 7.2% to now 6.5 at the end of the year. But much of that decline is the impact of the base effect, because you're comparing to a very high period of inflation in the last quarter of 2010. And that base effect will disappear. So the question is, will the government, will we lose the fiscal adjustment that we've heard and only get the decline of the Selic interest rate? And if that happens, will we then continue to have high inflation well above the official target, the midpoint of 4.5, and perhaps lower growth? I don't say absolute stagflation, but trending in that direction, converging toward that in 2012.
Thank you, Fred. Chris?
Now,
and then we go to the last question.
I think Fred, you put your finger on a critical kind of question, and and as you know, being a political scientist, not necessarily in a position or even the capacity that you have to actually to have a firm opinion over what's the extent of the slowdown? There's a lot of debate right now in the analytic community. In fact, kind of reaching a limit in terms of productive capacity. Some people are forecasting growth at 2.5% next year. More optimistic forecasts are, closer to 3.5. The government is saying 5, but in private they only hope for 4, or at least I think that more expectations are on 4. What is to answer your question? Let's assume a more negative growth scenario of, growth starting to dip close to 3, under 3, and still sticky high inflation, right? And the central bank stops cutting interest rates relatively soon because they don't see the inflationary pressures or room to cut interest rates more aggressively. And, my sense is that this is not going to be an administration that's going to panic. And that's why it was very important from a policy perspective that she finished her first year in office very strong. So this is a government, I think, that is feeling relatively confident in its political standing. And my sense is that in a economic slowdown or stronger economic slowdown than the government's anticipating, the reaction function will be first to increase measures of official credit through the BNDES, which we did have slow down in credit disbursement. We'll have an uptick in that, right? They're going to, release more macroprudential measures to unwind some of the controls that they did at the beginning of the year. And I think that they would only turn the loose on the fiscal side earnestly open in a way like they did in 2008, 2009, as a measure of ultimate last resort. I only see that occurring if growth really decelerates much more aggressively, close to 2.5 or under, right? And there, I think that so they will go down that path if necessary. But then again, if growth is under 2 and we're talking about 1% growth, that's a world where everything is going badly as well, right? That's probably a world where China is decelerating more aggressively than people anticipate. That's a world where Europe's starting to go down. And Brazil's fiscal solvency, I don't think, is such a huge concern that would be so problematic in that environment. But and then I would even say in a more extreme case, if the government gets into real problems and Rousseff gets into real political trouble, I don't think she's going to go ultimately populist. And this is where Lula is important. Because if this is an administration that gets into serious political trouble, the opposition is still not going to be in a position to be favored to win because Lula will be probably called upon to run again in 2014 if the political class believes Rousseff can't get reelected. So that kind of puts a political hedge to a much more negative environment. So that's why, anyway.
Yeah, the last question.
Yeah, I'm Dr. Sam Hancock of Emerald Planet TV, and this is to Kelly, first of all, and then to the others. Paulo, thank you for this excellent panel you have. What do you say that the United States and Brazil should be doing, say, over the next couple of years to boost the economies of both countries? You're saying there's a tremendous amount of investment flowing into Brazil from the United States and private companies. So what would you suggest that could move this forward that would help both countries as far as jobs and expanding the economies?
I mean, frankly, I think it's going to keep on going from a private sector perspective, no matter what the governments do. I think that there are things that the governments can do on the margins to support it. Diego, frankly, in his remarks made reference to a number of them. But I do think that at this point, I think, U.S. companies will continue to invest heavily in Brazil, but I do think that there's a lot more opportunity even on the Brazilian side to continue to leverage the opportunities here. But I don't see it as being something that we necessarily need to do anything from a policy perspective to encourage. I think they'll just happen.
Before I thank my speakers here today, I'd like to remind you about February 7th, 3:30 in the afternoon, about a documentary, 1-hour documentary about the Amazon, called Shark Loves the Amazon, Shark being the name of the producer, the nickname of the producer, Mark London. Very interesting. Also, there is the chances are that President Rousseff will be in Washington in mid-March, and we have offered to host her here. The indications I have received are that she has responded. She is favorably inclined. But on February 15th, we plan to have a session here on Brazil-U.S. relations, hearing mostly from American officials, members of the official sector, on the perspectives from the relationship. So we are going to announce this very soon, but put it in your calendar. It's the morning part of February the 15th. And with that, I would like to thank David, Chris, Kelly, and Diego for this very informative session. And please keep looking at our calendar of events. The video stream of this event will be up in a matter of days, so you can watch it again if you wish. Thank you very much, and come back. Bye-bye.